to run the session today, and thank you to everyone who's taken the time out of their day to join. I will just find the right file to share. Hopefully you can see that okay. So quick look then at what we'll cover. We're going to start with why pandemics, or this particular pandemic, presents challenges for fraud managers. I'll touch then on preparation and what we can do better. So how can we prepare for something similar?
That's very positive, up 12%.
We will then talk about the lessons that we've learned from COVID-19, and then what we might think could happen next in terms of what a new normal, or the next normal as I'm calling it, could look like. I'll highlight 3 takeaways, and then we'll have some time for questions. More than happy for people to ask questions. Please use the chat window or save them to the end. It doesn't really matter to me. What I will say though is this is probably a very British experience in terms of our experience with COVID-19 and in particular sort of the restrictions and things that we've been subject to in this country. So if you're from a territory that has taken a very different approach, some of these things might not apply, but hopefully I've tried to keep it at a level that's fairly generic and easily understood by all. A little bit about me before I move on. So I'm responsible for fraud management at Vodafone Group. So we own and operate 19 markets globally, with many more partners and other businesses like carrier and roaming. Previously, I was in management consulting with Accenture, so have experience in fraud management from many other industries. And prior to that, I was in retail banking, focused very much on first-party fraud. So if we move on then to the first topic. So why does a pandemic give us a headache, or more than a headache? And first off, we can't get away from the fact that our business runs because we have devoted and dedicated employees. It doesn't really matter how automated our systems are, we still need people at the end of the day to really make things happen. Now, all of a sudden, our employees have got a very differing life, a very different life, and they've got very challenged priorities. And those priorities won't necessarily align with those of the organisation. So they might have to care for loved ones, they might have to school their children, or isolate away from others in order just to stay safe. So our employees are going through a significant amount of change, and that in itself will mean that productivity and priority becomes an issue and a challenge. Secondly, the very nature of a crisis means that things will literally be up in the air and changing at a very rapid pace. For most, situations and severities vary from day to day, and this makes planning very hard. Decisions have to be taken very rapidly, and often without all of the information that you might want to have to hand in normal circumstances. Crisis also brings a certain amount of dread, whether it's us wishing that we'd practiced our business continuity plans a bit more, or at least knew where to find them, or for the very real consequences of losing colleagues, family and friends. Third is around fear. So it has a tendency to put most people on edge. And that's great for fraudsters, but it's not great for us as fraud managers. It's not good for the productivity of our companies. Fraudsters have successfully duped many people into paying for non-existent supplies, such as masks and hand sanitizer, or for paying very high prices for what are substandard goods. Fear may mean that customers become concerned for the security of their job role or the survival of their company if they're self-employed. Fear for others has often brought out the best of most of our communities, and people are very willing to give, whether that's money, goods, time, all for the benefit of other people. But people have been duped, and they will have given up more than they intended. And then finally, fear of catching the virus will mean that many people will do things like downloading malicious software to their mobile phones while thinking that they're just downloading a contact tracing app that's actually there to keep them safe and healthy. So fear will drive certain activities and certain behaviours in employees, in customers, and in companies themselves in order to survive and get through things, but also in the fraud community. Digital. So digital is probably the thing that's kept many of the global economies afloat during all the different lockdowns and stages that the pandemic has moved through. Now, your company may have been a significant force in the digital space before, or it might not. You might have been a digital only business or a digital first business, or it could have been all manual processes in the background, just with a very slick website and interface. Either way, the risks around that and dealing with people not in the face-to-face environment are quite different. Digital channels may have been flooded with orders, queries, both, and you have to find a way to deal with that and still discharge your responsibilities as a risk manager. New vulnerabilities may well have come to light in your channels. You might have had to close certain channels, such as your retail stores, just to keep staff safe and customers safe. And fraudsters, of course, who would have previously used things like a store network to perpetrate their crimes, would have had to find a new way to achieve them. So they will move to your call center and your online channels. I've put goodwill on here because undoubtedly goodwill has been abused. Fraudsters have posed as charities, companies that are applying for furlough support for employees without a genuine need will be doing so. Discounts intended to recognise the risks and efforts of frontline staff and healthcare workers will have been abused. Employees will have really taken the mickey with the level of work that they've completed, or they've taken advantage of a lack of oversight in what they do for a day job because they're now working from home. Or they've done something that they know they shouldn't have done. It will have all happened, but to differing degrees. And your company's culture and leadership will determine to what extent these are problems. And the last one I've got on here in terms of why the pandemic is a problem is really around pace. So the pace of change means that it's very, very difficult for even a devoted person who reads nothing but COVID-19 information all day to stay on top of the various advice and guidance. In the UK, one day we're having our own tracing app, the next day we're not. Some countries insist on wearing masks, others don't. There's a lack of consistency in response, and whilst we need to cooperate as an international community, we don't necessarily see that filtering through at the bottom line. A lack of ability to trust what's in front of us or what we hear means that many people will end up taking risks. If they don't know which piece of information in front of them is the correct one, then they'll assume that the one they want to believe is genuine. And many times, unfortunately, it won't be. Particularly with the pandemic, fraudsters have been very capable of using pace to their advantage and to our disadvantage. They don't have to go through approval hoops or speak to a commercial department before they do something to change their strategy and their approach. They just get the job done. They're far more agile. In the real world, analysis must be completed. You must review false positive rates, consider whether you need permission to deploy a new strategy or disconnect that SIM, and make contact with customers. All hurdles and blockades that fraudsters don't have to deal with. There's an inherent inflexibility in most large organisations that means that agile fraudsters have a very limited window in which to execute their campaigns. So how quickly were government communications spoofed? How many false COVID-19 helplines were called by people who genuinely wanted medical attention, but instead ended up with a large telephone bill? The pace of change and knowing what you can and can't trust is a big issue. So, if we look at how we can prepare better or differently if this happens again, we have to look at at preparation. And there are lots of famous quotes around preparation. So you've got Benjamin Franklin, by failing to prepare, you're preparing to fail. I don't believe in luck, I believe in preparation. Success is where preparation and opportunity meet. There are no secrets to success. It's the result of preparation, hard work, and learning from failure. So, how can we prepare better? The first one I've got up here is fraud risk assessments. And I'm a big advocate of fraud risk assessments. For me, it's one of the most underused tools in the fraud management armoury. And it should be a bigger part of our roles, I think, to future gaze and anticipate things. But for the most part, we often get caught firefighting or reacting to things or looking back through past numbers and past cases. In other industries such as banking, it's not uncommon to have roles in fraud teams that are purely focused on looking at future threats and preparing the company to deal with them. That could come about as a result of legislation or regulation, or it could come about because of a change in the external environment and advance in digital technologies, for example. When was the last time that you performed a very focused fraud risk assessment in your business? When was the last time you performed a broad fraud risk assessment? When was the last time that you used a fraud risk assessment to inform a decision that you had in front of you? And when was the last time you used a fraud risk assessment to seek investment to develop some proactive controls? If, when the pandemic started, you had a fraud risk assessment completed and available for you to refer to, you'd have been able to go back to that and look at it and understand the underlying assumptions you'd made. And in light of COVID-19, you could have made some adjustments to those to understand where you expected to come out. As a really obvious example, with the restrictions in global travel and a real lack of roaming activity, you could immediately take staff off working roaming fraud alerts and queues in that space and put them somewhere perhaps where you're experiencing higher volumes. So premium rate calling or subscription. If you know where your highest risks are, you know what work you can reduce and where you need to focus, especially in cases where you've got very limited resource. So if you've got a staff shortage because you've got people who are having to not work because they're exhibiting symptoms, or because they're having to care for other people, or because sales through your digital channel have risen exponentially, then having that fraud risk assessment to hand can help you understand where's the value that you need to protect and where's the value that you need to deliver as a fraud manager. Next on this list of preparing is around playbooks. So for me, being good at conducting fraud risk assessments, it's not about having the biggest or the best crystal ball. It's not about even being right about what the future will hold. It's about anticipation and judgment. Can you anticipate what could happen and judge how well situated you are to defend yourself from those things? So if and when they occur, you can make adjustments to what you're doing so that you can react in the most appropriate way. If you think that the impact of that thing becoming real is really significant, you'll want to develop a playbook. And I've worked with companies in the past where they've not necessarily had those playbooks and then they've faced the consequences as a result. In the heat of your crisis response, you want to not have to think too hard about what you need to do next or who you need to involve. Having a playbook doesn't absolve you of the need for very reasoned and independent thought, but it does mean that you don't have to remember which stakeholders you need to reach out to or where to find particular data or systems that you might want to scrutinise. Ask yourself if your privacy or technology security teams have playbooks developed in case a data breach occurs. The answer is they probably do. And that might be because they know they're going to get a big fine if data does leak out, or they're going to be sued by a class action. But it's also to make sure they get the best response out of the business in what are very difficult circumstances. So what would you do if there was an allegation of financial statement fraud, for example, against your employer lodged tomorrow. It has the potential to impact your share price, employee morale, market perception, brand value, brand perception, and even drive activist activity such as boycotts of your services. It might drive regulatory attention, or people might even be arrested. It could possibly be the most significant fraud risk you face. And do you know how you'd react if that were to become real tomorrow? Third on my list is resilience. I don't know how many organisations expected nearly all of their workforce to be working from home at any one time. Some businesses certainly wouldn't have seen the need or the legal mandate to have to close their doors. How many organisations would have been prepared for most of their employees to be working from home? I think in Vodafone's case, we've got around 95% of our global workforce at home. And we've managed to achieve that in a very, very short space of time. So in terms of resilience and how well prepared you are to keep going, do all of your employees have access to laptops and phones? How quickly could your VPNs be scaled to cope? Were your VC technologies up to the job? Did everyone have a headset so they could be heard properly? And if you have data that's previously confined to processing centres and call centres, and that data is now readily accessed and accessible from what might otherwise be considered insecure premises, like an employee's home, how are data protection approaches holding firm? And were you prepared for that level of monitoring? Can your fraud solutions facilitate the alerts and case management to allow for a greater range of use cases to be considered? Was your organisation agile enough to flex rules, limits and cut-offs to meet the changing environment and the changing circumstances? Were any of your fraud managers or senior managers on the inside of discussions in your companies as preparations were being made to stop people coming into work? Were you ready and prepared, or did you have to react to the news once you'd read it on your intranet? Did your customers or your victims of fraud notice a difference in the service or protection you were able to provide? And was everyone in your teams able to perform their job as if they'd still been in the office? Was everything still possible? Could they access all of the reports they needed to review? Could they access all of the systems they needed to access? Or did you have to adapt and persevere and find new ways to work? And then finally, insider, and this will be a theme that sort of comes out of our time together this afternoon, because for me, this is probably one of the more dynamic areas that has shifted as a result of the pandemic. So we need to understand and accept that the insider risk here is actually quite different to pre-pandemic times. So if you can acknowledge that most of your employees are working from home, how are you going to monitor their activity? Are there roles that you know you should monitor more than others? Do you know what those roles are? And how can you robustly remind employees of the need to report any concerns they have through your whistleblowing facilities? Most operators, most businesses have seen a drop in tip-off calls. So how can you ensure that concerns are flagged? And how can you ensure that your employees are still able, in a remote environment, to identify things that might be a concern in others? The ACFE will tell us that around half of all internal fraud is detected because of tip-offs. So if you're not getting as many tip-offs through your whistleblowing facilities, how are you finding that internal fraud? Because it's not necessarily stopping just because of the pandemic. There's also the possibility that a lack of end-to-end scrutiny during lockdown, for example, will give people the perfect opportunity to perpetrate fraud. So this will mean that they end up being able to perpetrate that fraud for a longer period of time and ultimately cost you, your shareholders, more money. Are you ready for that? Are you looking for a perpetrator, and do you have third parties on call to help with difficult investigations? Do you know how, or even if you can, conduct investigations when movement of people is very restricted? Are your e-forensic capabilities up to scratch? And organised criminals faced with the closure of some of their key routes into your business won't just abandon their efforts, they'll adjust their business model and they'll find other ways in. They'll target other employees of yours and they might coerce them, they might induce them. Typically, they'll try and go after those who are distracted with other things or maybe needing additional income in what are very difficult times for many people. So we have to acknowledge that the pressure to commit fraud may well increase during times like these. And the people who've lost their jobs, their income may have been seized partially or even completely. They might be having to rely on social security and benefits that don't cover their bills. Think of the pandemic as what may be the straw that breaks the camel's back when they're already at tipping point. So if we start to think about the lessons that we've learned from the experience of the pandemic and COVID-19, the first one I've got here is around prey. And I don't mean in the religious sense. Within hours of the UK government issuing a text about COVID-19, imposters were sending texts to try and conduct phishing and harvest people's details. Before the end of March, there'd been more than 100 reports of scams or fraud in the UK relating specifically to coronavirus. Losses at that point had already hit or exceeded £1 million. So it's clear that no matter what the situation, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's a natural disaster, there will be people somewhere who will be looking to understand how they can systematically create an advantage out of other people's disadvantage and difficulty. So in the telecom space, there were adverts placed advertising that coronavirus testing would be available if you called a particular number, or that you could access medical support and advice. And of course, people just calling an IRSF number. By capitalising on people's fear, some shops will have increased prices of just very basic groceries, preying on people's fear that they don't know when they're going to be able to buy that thing again. We touched already on the supply of substandard goods or not supplying them at all. How many of our procurement functions were very, very rapidly trying to buy hand sanitizer, laptops, face masks, temperature sensors, or anything like that as the crisis started to take hold? How confident can we be that our standard procurement processes would be able to identify goods as being substandard or just make sure they even turn up? Fraud really is all around. It's everywhere. There are huge social employment support schemes that have been launched by governments the world over in very, very short timescales, all in efforts to keep economies afloat. But how much scrutiny has there really been of those things? Charities will pop up and happily relieve you of your savings, but of course they're not going to be genuine charities. But taking advantage of everyone's goodwill in communities, particularly at the start of the pandemic when people weren't sure what was going on, what was official and what wasn't, it just means it's ripe for the taking. If we think about businesses, many businesses will have gone into an effective hibernation as lockdown was imposed, and often with very little notice or any preparation time for that. So whilst the last one out might have locked the front door, they wouldn't necessarily have thought through every eventuality and what it actually means to temporarily close a business. How many of those businesses have kept an eye on their PBX? We've seen small increases in PBX fraud and nefarious activity there. So it's not just about a company's ability to protect itself, but in the case of something like a PBX or other hardware, it's also about the suppliers you're dependent upon and their ability to issue patches. And if their workforce is decimated because of the virus, how are those patches going to get developed? And how's your monitoring capability going to cope with having to pick up the slack? Number 4 I've put as déjà vu. In many cases, and there are several examples that I've come across myself, businesses have had to react to do the best thing for society. And that might not necessarily be aligned with profit generation and revenue generation. The focus has very much been on keeping people connected at a time when people are feeling quite isolated and they're unable to have the same physical interaction and discussion that they might normally have. That connection is really, really important. So it's quite possible that in those efforts to keep everything going, normal standards, normal approval processes might not have been followed. They might have been bypassed in order to get something done for the greater good. So it's really important from a fraud manager's perspective to record what you think those changes are and revisit them when your capacity and your prioritization allows, so that you can make sure that the changes that have been put in place in your business are still sound from a fraud prevention, fraud management perspective. So in the UK, one of the responses, I think, from all the networks was that any government website that was presenting pandemic-related information was effectively 0 rated, so that people, whether they had credit, if they were pay-as-you-go, or up to date on their account if they were post-pay, everyone would be able to access the health information they needed. All very, very noble. But the reality is that when you 0 rate more and more URLs, you're creating more opportunity for data charging bypass. So doing the right thing for society is actually creating a fraud risk, or exacerbating a fraud risk in the business. If those decisions are taken in isolation, then how are we necessarily certain that we can make the right preparation to look for those things? In some of our mobile money markets, we have a mobile money product called M-Pesa in predominantly African markets. Some of the regulators actually insisted that because banks had to close, mobile money wallets had to be given to everyone where a very basic level of KYC, know your customer documentation, was held, so that everyone would have the ability to perform basic banking transactions. So whilst KYC is typically more associated with money laundering, it's actually a really key part of the subscription process where you do post-pay. So making sure that, you know, if that's a temporary measure, it really is temporary, and you go back and you undo those things, it is really important. Number 5, our ability to adapt. We know that fraudsters are very, very adept at adapting, and this is to their advantage. But the pandemic has also shown that customers, companies, and employees are incredibly capable of adapting. So can we find a way to identify how we can leverage these skills to better stay on top of fraud problems? The ways that we deliver to customers will adapt too. So in time, will they demand more digital and less face-to-face? What does that mean for onboarding? We've seen our workforces achieve a massive amount in a very short space of time, initially in the early stages of the pandemic. So there were huge efforts to get our workforces working from home. We didn't have 95% of our global workforce at home prior to the pandemic. They needed the facilities. In some markets, we've actually put desktop PCs in taxis and shipped them to employees' homes. In others, we've been able to establish and build laptops and share those instead. So largely speaking, we haven't had significant outages. We haven't had continuity issues. And the level of protection that our company and our customers expect and deserve has been maintained. And that's really pretty impressive. So our ability to adapt is as good. We just concentrate it in a different way. And then the last lesson that I want to put on here is around trust. So for me, fake news is a real issue. Not only is it really misleading, It undermines trust, which I think is really, really vital in the security space and the fraud space. And rather than people becoming untrusting of certain things or becoming more savvy so that they can discern the difference between fake and real, they become mistrusting of everything. And that creates problems for us as fraud managers. So if consumers don't know what to trust or what messages to trust in, if we're asking them to protect themselves, for example, or to run a security update on their phone, so that they can take sensible precautions to protect themselves and ultimately our businesses and our bottom lines, that becomes really difficult. From a fraud detection perspective, customers may be performing an action they believe to be completely legitimate, such as phoning what they think is a COVID-19 helpline, just for some advice, but ending up with a large bill instead. So it's then left to you as the operator to establish whether the customer's being genuine or whether they were part of the traffic pumping scam in the first place. And if you side with the consumer and you can't withhold payment down the carrier chain, you're left holding the loss. So not only do you have a challenging customer experience in terms of having to decide whether you accuse them of being complicit in the fraud or not, you also have a financial loss sitting on your account potentially. So customer experiences become difficult because we can't necessarily have the same level of trust that we had before. If we move on to the sort of the final key section that I'll cover, is what I'm badging the next normal. I'm not calling it the new normal because that's far too common really. But I think that the question is, will anything really be normal again? And if so, how long will that last? So I've just called out 4 things here that I think will definitely be different. And the first is 9 to 5. You know, working patterns have changed. Certainly, my experience within Vodafone is that people are a lot more accepting now of flexible working, not just remote working, but proper flexible working. So dropping children off at school or popping out in the day to walk the dog. There's a lot more acceptance of a more relaxed approach to the work environment. And that's all been brought about because of the pandemic. I think many of the big tech firms have suggested that they will likely do away with the requirement for employees to have a really long commute into one big building in a particular city in favour of having more regional offices and giving people shorter commutes and more family time. So our jobs are less 9 to 5 than they've ever really been. I think many people now, as we've got over the hump of the pandemic, people are actually finding they're working more because they're not commuting and doing that sort of thing. Employers were previously preparing for the millennial workforce to come through the ranks, and we've had to rapidly adjust things like hiring processes, equipment provision, travel policies, and meeting arrangements. How do you check someone's ID appropriately through a webcam if you're thinking about hiring them? Can you validate their educational background still, or do you still need physical evidence, or will electronic evidence suffice? How do you onboard someone and indoctrinate them to your company's culture? For example, setting out that fraud is unacceptable and won't be tolerated if inductions are performed remotely via Zoom. And how do you spot that a colleague's behaviour is out of the ordinary, or it should be something of a concern if you've never met them in person, or you don't get to physically observe them anymore? The ramifications and changes to our working patterns must be considered, both from an internal fraud and an external fraud perspective. If we acknowledge that our frontline employees, whether they're store or call centre staff, are targets for organised criminals, for example, facilitating data leakage or undertaking SIM swaps, how can we best look out for those employees who might be most susceptible? Even on a really basic level, if our fraud operation is dependent on being able to address the volume of work in a set period of time, can we really embrace true flexible working as our employees seem to be demanding? Can we still get through that same volume of work in that same block of time if someone is out walking the dog. The second I've put on here is around the digital world. Customers have clearly adapted to not having access to physical stores, not being able to get out to them. There's been no alternative for them but to just get on with it. So will business return to normal? Will we need as many physical stores as we had pre-pandemic? Probably not. One UK company has already, partway through the pandemic, announced their plans for mass store closures and having a significant redesign of their operations and their routes to market. So while some might see it as opportunistic, it's likely to have been in the pipeline for some time. So perhaps they were already headed down a very digital path anyway. But I'd be very surprised if coming out of the pandemic, there's not a much greater focus on digital than we have previously. Customers' expectations around the immediacy of service they receive might be adjusted. There seems to be an increased acceptance of wait times for things like customer service responses because of the pandemic. I don't know if those will necessarily hold firm post-pandemic, but activating and getting hold of goods and services more quickly is likely to just grow and become more in demand. So will we see things like eSIM, the use and proliferation of eSIM accelerate so that they can have services more quickly? Will there be greater pressure on logistics firms to provide same-day delivery? Not something we're typically used to in the UK, certainly not in rural areas like I live in. So what would that mean for subscription fraud controls? How can you stop those devices going out if there's massive pressure to get them out the door really quickly? Third that I've got on here is recession. So it's widely acknowledged that there are going to be significant economic ramifications for the responses that we've had to provide globally to the pandemic. I think I read that the UK is going to be paying off its debt that it's generating as its pandemic response for longer than it's taken to repay the debts that we accrued in our response to World War II. That's going to mean that there's massive pressure on our customers and our governments. And those customers, of course, could be consumers or they could be businesses, small or large. So depending on how long social distancing and lockdown measures stay in place, there could be much greater opportunity for our employees to commit internal fraud. If a loved one has lost their job, they might have the incentive to commit a fraud against the employer. If our sales teams have been unable to sell for 6 months of the year, how are they going to be feeling about their sales targets? And if customers want the latest handset, will they be honest when they're applying for the finance to fund it? If business customers can't generate a profit because they're not allowed to operate for the purpose that their business was created, will they seek opportunities to diversify at our cost? And then the last thing that I've got on here is really around outliers. Normal isn't normal anymore. And what we previously considered as abnormal must also therefore change. So if our understanding of what an outlier is different, and so our understanding of what an outlier is becomes different to what it was before. So whether we're considering it from an internal fraud perspective and we're looking at employee behaviour or our customer behaviour. So if we go back to travel and roaming example, with travel almost entirely stopping internationally, roaming calls will have dropped significantly. International calling from home will therefore have increased, as will use of video conferencing. So people will have replaced their roaming activity with other behaviours and other normals. Even at a base level, thresholds and rules will need to be adapted more frequently as we all figure out what normal even is. And who's to say that we're best placed to work that out? I would expect that there needs to be a much greater prominence on technologies such as artificial intelligence, so that when we couple that with our data and our experience, we're in a much more informed position to establish what normal is and what it isn't. We have to hope that the vendors are taking note. And so I turn to three key takeaways. First is to do a fraud risk assessment. if you can improve the understanding of your environment and the risks you're carrying so that you can undertake scenario analysis or stress testing of any kind, then you can better understand what's going to happen to fraud, whatever normal is established. So fraud risk assessment is key. Secondly, look at internal fraud. I know it's the proverbial needle in the haystack, but there's more opportunity, more pressure, and probably more rationalisation in our employees' minds than ever before. But bear in mind that that's not going to be immediately obvious. New ways of working are going to require new ways of detecting internal fraud, and you may not even know that the risk exists yet unless you followed my advice in step 1. And then third, don't forget your manners. Please say please and thank you a lot. You're relying on the goodwill and culture of collaboration across your employees and across your company to get things done. And that's now through any lockdown and beyond. Acknowledge the successes that your team have and keep them motivated and share them. Demonstrate how proud you are. Many of us are probably feeling fatigued and isolated to an extent from having to work from home and being stuck in, these 4 walls. But don't let that stop you and your teams achieving from what needs to be done. So I appreciate that I've asked more questions than I've probably answered, but I'm okay with that. I'm okay with it because my answers to these questions is fairly irrelevant. And it's irrelevant because I don't work in your company with your culture. I certainly don't have your budget or your technology or your responsibilities. The answers to these questions needs to be specific to you and your circumstances. So I'd encourage you all to think about just some of the questions I've asked and seek out some answers. Use them to inform your plans and make a difference to the outcomes you need to realise. And with that, I will stop talking and see if there are any questions.